Celebrating 50 years of British blind sport, we are delighted to kick off our Golden Legacy podcast series. Today, we are welcoming Tim Hollingsworth OBE, the current CEO of Sport England. Join us as Tim shares key moments from his remarkable career, from the success of the London 2012 Paralympic Games during his time at the British Paralympic Association to driving change at Sport England. A force to be reckoned with, Tim offers insight into promoting social inclusion and accessibility in sport and reflects on the resilience and innovation required to steer Sport England through the COVID-19 pandemic and championing the Uniting the Movement strategy. We are delighted to invite Tim and we hope you enjoy. So Tim, it's lovely to have you here today. For those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you've come to where you are today, really.
Certainly, Elena, thank you. And I'm delighted to be with you and be part of this series. I'm an unusual sports administrator in a couple of contexts. One, I'm by no means alone in this, but I'm one of those who doesn't have any real quality or history as an elite sports person whatsoever, quite the reverse. I was certainly not one of those like Catherine Granger or Chris Boardman or those who have been around my landscape more recently who've excelled on the field of play. So I'm very much somebody who sees my role as a leader in sport as creating the opportunity for others and not fulfilling my own vision for what it might be. I'm certainly, probably, I think, the only sort of sports leader currently who has a master's degree in drama. I think it's one of the places I always start. Because actually my initial, when you say tell me a bit about myself, my background and even my education through to university level, it was more around the arts. And
Wow,
I got
I
the
didn't know
degree, master's degree in drama in the end as a sort of output, which I'm fiercely proud, by the way. I had a teacher that said it would be about as useful as a criminal record when it came to getting a job. But actually, if you think if we're doing a podcast around what it takes to be a good leader, I think that communication and that sense of identity of audiences and how you influence and engage people is pretty important. But that was my journey through to that. What meant that actually what I became a professional in was public relations, communications work across consultancies, worked for the CBI as head of media, worked for Granada, the TV company, as head of communications. And I was in a consultancy in 2004 when UK Sport advertised for a new post as a director of policy and communications. And the brilliant and wonderful Baroness Sue Campbell, who was the chair of doing the recruiting at that time, was clearly very adamant in her own mind that she wanted someone from outside the sector to come into UK Sport in that, who understood how government worked, who understood how the media worked, but didn't feel that they had a history and a background in sport. And that was my lucky break.
She's very astute, those two.
Yeah.
And actually, you kind of need that to have a different viewpoint, don't you, sometimes?
Yeah.
You don't want to do same old. You do the same thing.
That's
you get
what
the same
she was
results.
afraid of when she was shaking up UK sport, I think. But that's why I'm here. Because in 2004, I applied for a job with UK Sport from outside of the sports sector. And I just had the extraordinary moment and fortune that I was successful in becoming that director of policy and communication. So I had the skill set, but I had no historic relationship with sport in any context other than just passionate fan. And that's my background, really. That was in 2004. I started early in 2005. I think it would have been a very important, consequential role anyway, but not long after I started, we won the bid to host the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Yep. And from that moment, both UK Sport and my own trajectory completely changed, because clearly the initial impetus there to make sure that we were funding effectively, obviously UK Sport's primary role is to fund the Olympic and Paralympic success through the National Lottery. I got so much exposure very quickly then to that high performance environment, but also the sporting landscape, and obviously through 2012, some of the real power and purpose of that as well. And it was only because the opportunity to take over at the BPA emerged in 2011 that I thought even remotely about leaving, because I was very happy at UK Sport. But it was the absolute introduction I'd had at that point in my UK Sport role to the Paralympic movement, to where it was, to the hidden gem that it was then, actually, looking back to Athens and Beijing and the Games, very successful on the field of play, hardly visible off the field of play to the large
very
proportion
much
of people.
so, very much so.
And some great, thinking back to the person who actually became my chair, but Tim Reddish, a swimmer, obviously Chris Holmes as well, another blind swimmer, some athletes of real consequence in the history of the Paralympic movement. In 2011, though, there was the chance a year before the Games to apply to become chief executive of the BPA. I was ambitious to be a CEO for that role rather more than just generally. And then obviously from that point on, I've had a privileged position in 2 roles of being able to have some influence and some opportunity to serve the Paralympic movement for 7 years as CEO, and then to move from that in 2018 into my current role at Sport England. So you said, tell a bit about yourself. There's more than a bit perhaps, but I think the interesting thing is, for me, always it's been about the role sport plays in our community, the role that sport can play in an individual's life, and the difference it can make to society.
Yeah, I'm going to break those down because there's 2 very different things there as well. I will come on to your role in Sport England in a moment, but the BPA, the work there is very much down the elite end. And then you've got the work that you've been doing at Sport England. We'll come on to your passion for that grassroots. But you just said something then that, like you, I'm not a sports person, never have been. But what I do know, and I feel very passionate about, and I think that passion is shared with you, Tim, is that sport is the springboard for so much change.
Yes. I think you're spot on. And I think that the power that sport has in our society is that it can, to a degree, be an end in itself, right? So I have unhealthy interest in certain performers or teams doing well. That's purely personal, whether it's a football team or an athlete, or Rory McIlroy winning the Masters a couple of weeks ago in the golf for this. I have sort of personal passion for that can almost be seen as an end in itself. But that's actually not the driver, and that's not the motivation at all. The motivation is the realization that sport is a incredibly powerful and very inclusive, potentially inclusive at least, vehicle for enabling people to have a better life and to live a happier and healthier life, and also do it in a way that makes sense to them and can give them agency and can give purpose to communities as well. In a nutshell, the sense that sport is a tool for wider social benefit is why it's been such a privilege to be part of it over quite an exceptional period.
You talked about inclusivity there. So going back to London 2012, absolute pivotal moment in the world, really, for Paralympic sport. Now, you may or may not recall this, but and you'll have to give me the right facts. You were talking at one of the BPA meetings before the Games that I think you'd gone over to the Netherlands, and somebody over in the Netherlands said to you that the GB was streets ahead and that the world would be watching. I don't know if you even recall that conversation.
I do recall it, and it was, I'm trying to remember the name of my Dutch counterpoints, but I do exactly remember what you said.
Yeah. What I remember, and I don't even know if you recall just how powerful that was when you told the room, because for me, we were just coming into the Games and hearing you, it was in a new field. For me, yeah, I'd started at BBS not long before you'd started at the BPA, and I was thinking, this is unknown territory. But Tim Reddish had mentioned something about we're going to sprinkle magic here. And then you said, and the world is watching. And my counterparts, your counterparts, not mine, yours were saying to you, we're watching. And I felt the weight of that for you. I thought, oh my goodness, this poor guy, I hope we're going to get this right. And boy, did we get it right. It must have been such an exciting time and nerve-wracking. But tell us about it.
I will a little. I mean, to a degree, London is an extraordinary thing to have the privilege of looking back on now, because I had only taken on, I mean, the advantage I had coming out of UK sport and the role, I knew many of the sports and the people that were in charge of them or making decisions around them. I knew government quite well, which was extremely helpful going into the home games. And I knew the people within London 2012 to a degree that I needed to know to be able to help make things happen in and around the Paralympics. But it was quite a blur also going into that point, and just realizing, and actually probably the best and most sensible decision I made within my first weeks and months at the BPA was that I couldn't personally take my eye off what happened afterwards. And if you'll recall, in early 2012, we published a strategy at the BPA that was called Maximising Momentum, because the absolute belief was we should not see London as the pinnacle moment, but the starting gun to greater, more powerful change. And partly that was because my brilliant colleagues within the BPA, including some that are still there, like Penny Briscoe, who's become this sort of doyen of performance sport in terms of her understanding of what it takes to win and how it takes to win. But also, we were really well served by LOCOG for the Paralympics. So from SEBCO down, people within LOCOG who had positions of real influence. Chris Holmes, obviously vital to that with his Director of Paralympic Integration role.
Yeah.
But also Paul Dighton as the CEO, who always referred to the London Olympic and Paralympic Games. So the first time that really happened, the sort of slightly fearsome comms director, Jackie Brock Doyle, once went around with post-it notes and stuck on every desk something saying WATP was all it said. And it created a real buzz. And it stood for, what about the Paralympics? And it was asking everybody in their role, actually, when you're thinking about transport, or you're thinking about the catering, or you're thinking about whatever role you have, are you thinking about the Paralympics as well as the Olympics? So we were incredibly well served by LOCOG, and of course by the marketing team and the comms team, and the decision to bring on Channel 4 and the unique Sainsbury's commercial partnership that LOCOG did. Never before had been a spot. Brilliant deal for Sainsbury's, by the way, given what they were able to get from it. So I guess the picture I'm painting is, yes, it was nerve-wracking, but actually part of it for me in the BPA was seeing brilliant people who'd been working for some time were bringing it together in an incredible way, including my own team. So part of my focus even then was on, so what next? How do we leverage it as an organization, but how do we leverage it as a movement? And so coming up with maximizing momentum felt really important, that we put our stall out before the games to say this can only be the starting gun. We banned the word legacy. We absolutely banned the word legacy. There's no legacy. Legacy suggests you've reached your high point and you're trying to sustain it. We talked about momentum from the games, but it was an amazing time.
I recall you that. I remember you saying, so what happens next? What are we going to do? And I think you talked about other games where the Paralympic movement has sort of had a bit of a crescendo and then dropped, and you were really keen that that didn't happen.
That was also, you're harking back to the eyes of the world. They knew that the birthplace of the movement, right? So Stoke Mandeville, the home birthplace of the games, a team that has been consistently successful on the field of play, probably the most advanced athlete support system across the world. That whole sense of like where we'd gone even in the years pre-London to support Paralympic athletes to elite level and grow the pathway, they were genuinely watching, but probably 13 years on nearly. My reflection on what I said to you at the time is less now feels like it was a warning from the rest of the world. It was an anticipation and an excitement from the rest of the world that we can't wait, we can't wait to watch what you're going to do. And of course, the beauty is we excelled all expectations. Again, the nation's experience of a Paralympics was transformed by London. Paralympics now, I mean, Paris was a fantastic experience, I think, for everyone. Rio had enormous challenges, but was still a great games. Tokyo would have been amazing were it not for COVID. But nothing had happened like it happened in London before London. I sort of say this often, we may not have the best games, but we will always have had the greatest games, I think.
Oh, that's a really lovely way to look at it. And going back to that Dutch counterpart of yours, I think when you told the room, I think it was like, it sounded like to me that they were looking to us to lead.
Yes.
To lead the way, not a warning, but more of a show us the right way. And I think you and the team at the BPA and many others like LOCOG and stuff did that.
And many others, including the membership, by the way.
Yeah, including the thank you. And also the volunteers. Remember the great volunteers? It was a whole family, wasn't it? And a whole movement. And both of those, leadership and movement, fit nicely into my next questions. Because so you've done all of that, and then you've gone to unite the movement as the leader of Sport England. Tell us a little bit about that. What has been your main achievement during your tenure? You've been there almost 7 years. You've obviously had COVID right smack bang in the middle of that. What has been the achievements, but also what have been the challenges?
Well, one answer to that, Elena, is that the greatest, in some ways, for me, the greatest achievement was in the face of the greatest challenge, which is how, as a sector, we were able to support and Sport England was able to both financially, but I think also in terms of prioritisation and purpose, sort of steward through the COVID pandemic.
Yes.
And we're recording this the day after we've released the latest active lives numbers, and we have never had a more active nation. There are more people being active now than since we started to record the data 10 years ago, and 30 million people are adults are doing at least 150 minutes every week. There is some bounce back from, it's still a long way to go, and we can come on to that as well in terms of disabled people particularly. But the COVID period was so hard, and so difficult for so many organisations,
Mm.
it also had a beyond fundamental impact on activity levels, because clearly, whilst people were encouraged to be active for an hour a day and lockdown, and what it shut down was an infrastructure. And so I'm very proud indeed, and feel that one of my greatest achievements in leading this team, who in turn led the wider team, who in turn kept a sector focused, engaged. We generated an awful lot of opportunity for people to be active within the confines of lockdown, tools, resources, all that sort of thing. We were genuinely creative and flexible. I miss those days because we don't quite have that flexibility now from government, but the way we spent our money in COVID was really about keeping lights on, keeping people going, just being able to support. And it felt really consequential. We worked really hard to make small awards to a lot of community clubs that might have gone under otherwise. We were very thoughtful too about how we might try and rebuild from COVID and some of the lessons that we'd learned. But actually, coming from that, I feel probably now 7 years on, and as we might talk about, I'll be moving on in a few weeks' time, that actually uniting the movement is not a strategy for Sport England. It's become a strategy for the sector. How do we work collaboratively together to maximise the capability and the resources that we have collectively to enable people to live a more active life, to get involved in sport? And how do we, in doing that, unashamedly seek to prioritise the inequalities that exist in activity currently? The fact that 4 years on, 5 years on, uniting the movement sits anywhere but on a dusty shelf is still very live to people's minds.
It's part of the language now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think is possibly the thing of which I'm proudest, because Sport England at the end of the day is a convening investor. We're not a deliverer. We're here to create the conditions for others to be able to provide, including your members and yourselves. And for me, that needs purpose-driven leadership, it needs strategic leadership, and it needs strategic investment. But it also needs an organisation that really is seeking to try and be collaborative in how it works. And I think we're on that journey. We're not there yet, but we're collectively on that journey. And uniting the movement is more than a document. It's a way of working. And I think that's an achievement that's come out of my tenure.
That's amazing. And I have to say, just going back to something you said a moment ago about keeping the lights on, I want to thank you personally, because during that time, it is government funding, it's public money. You need to ask the questions, what are you going to spend this money on, which is quite rightly to anybody that Sport England funds. But during that period, Sport England opened its doors and said, what can we do to help? And so we had the Tackling Inequalities Fund, and then we had the Together Fund, which was that little bit more, let's have an immediate response to this crisis, and then let's react in a strategic way. Right, if you're going to ask us to still give you money to keep the lights on, tell us how you're going to use that money, how you're going to become sustainable in the future, what can you do? And you used people like us, members that were also benefiting from Sport England, to actually get to those clubs. I think we supported 78 clubs in total, of people that were specifically visually impaired, for clubs that were represented, because you knew as well that being that investor non-deliverer, that you looked at the rest of the movement to say, tell us who your members are, tell us who needs that help. So a huge thank you to that strategic setup that you did, because you and your team and Sport England saved many, many clubs from going under. And I don't know if Joe Public even knows that.
Well, I'm grateful for you putting it in those terms. I think the thing that I would reflect back is it also took the desire and willingness to work differently in our partners, not least those that became system partners, those that have become those consequential fundamental organisations like National Disability Sport organisations, and clearly British Blind Sport, one of those. I feel really so proud of what you just said there for one reason, which is I think other versions of how we might have done it might have thought that we could do all of that ourselves, and we couldn't. And instead, what we did was we trusted expert partners to take on that delivery and understand where the need was greatest. And we learned a huge amount as a result. And as we are now investing in a slightly more strategic way post-COVID into places, and we are really focused in around expanding our investment into local delivery, that principle still retains its heartbeat, which is actually by creating the conditions in places that are least well served, that are characterized primarily by social and economic deprivation and levels of inactivity, but also where communities perhaps feel that they're not included in the conversation. By devolving our investment through places, we can be more sure that we're reaching those communities, or at least have a better chance of reaching those communities than if we were to take top-down decisions transactionally from a headquarters somewhere, I don't know, Loughborough or London, and think we understand what actually might work in Wigan. There is that sense of what you identified in COVID, I hope we've kept, which is that collaborative understanding that others are best placed to deliver. How can we create the conditions for that has retained a key part of what we're here to do.
And I think for any listeners to this podcast, is that place-based work is something that Sport England sort of have been driving, certainly. And then organisations like us have stood back and said, actually, we get that, we understand that. We've always, because disabled people are more disproportionately affected economically, we've always identified pockets of where communities are. But actually, what we're now doing, instead of having a big national spread of, we're a small team, there's only 11 of us. It's like, okay, let's focus on some of these places and bring in the local partners that can help that delivery, learn from it, and then go to the next one, and then go to the next one, making sure it's sustainable along the way and that there's people there to support. So
I tell you how important it is for you to be using that language and speaking that way, Elena. I know you would, because you've been an advocate and around it for a long time, but every time I hear one of those organizations who might otherwise think, well, I'm over here delivering and I don't really care what's going on in the wider sector, actually talk very differently and say, no, we want to be involved. We want to be connected. We want to see what we can do with the national governing bodies. We want to see what we can do with the places. Is there a way we can integrate into the healthcare provision and social prescribing in a place? Is there a way that we can, all those pieces come together? We're going to move the dial. We're not going to move the dial if all we do is say, well, I'm here with my pot of money and I'm going to deliver X. And the best analogy for it in some ways for me is within schools, in that you can have the same pot of money and you can invest it in delivery, which is what we have historically done for a long time, where you might characterize it by a bloke turning up in a van with a bag of balls, putting some cones out, doing 2 hours of sport, and that's provision. And it has no consequential systemic impact at all. Or you can actually say, how do we use this money to create connections within schools, to leverage the capability and the expertise within those schools and the resources? And how do we actually perhaps use it to train up those within the schools to be able to oversee, particularly at primary level, the sort of activity that we want to see? And therefore, when the money maybe steps away, that's embedded, it's part of the landscape, and people are working together. And the same principle's been applied for many years in international development, that sense that you actually go and you provide capacity rather than resource in a most effective way, is how we should be thinking about it all, and what you're doing, definitely. Yeah.
And it is a newer way of thinking, although newer way of thinking in some parts of the sector. I certainly sat down with my team back in October and said, right, we're going to be brave today. We're going to talk about how we're going to change things, because you can do the same things and you'll get the same results. But I think genuinely, and I think I've had this conversation with you, I've definitely had this conversation with Tim Reddish, we want a time when there are no national disability sports organisations. We want society to be able to do it themselves. So if I keep turning up with a bag of balls and keep giving the provision, then quite frankly, why would anyone else bother? So let's skill people up, let's grow capacity, let's help make cultural shift, and then we can hopefully start to walk away. It's a fantastic way of looking at it.
Yes, I mean, good, short answer in a podcast. I completely agree with you.
Right, well, let's see if we agree here. How do you think, and I'm sure we will, how do you think disability sport and physical activity has, and we're going right down disability sport now, not just the wider sport, and I know you, obviously with your background in the BPA, and you've been such a champion for disability sport at Sport England, it's been fantastic. How do you think that's improved in recent years? And bearing in mind, we did have a global pandemic right in the middle of it. Yeah.
Well, and in some ways, the picture is painted a bit by the impact of COVID and the overly challenging environment that was created for many disabled people as a result, physically and mentally, in terms of their capability to be active, play sport. I've thought about this quite a lot, not just for the podcast, but also as a sort of part of my proudly over the last 3 years, I've also fulfilled a role called the government's Access Ambassador for Sport and Physical Activity, where I report periodically into the Minister for Disabled People and the Cabinet Office about how we're seeking to create the conditions for disabled people to, in my case, be active. In other cases, it's transport or tourism or travel. And actually, I am seeing a real tipping point, because I think that the language and opportunity and expectation is changing positively around the need to think, behave, work differently for disabled people. I think, by the way, should pay tribute to the fact that the traditional sports sector and system and the pathway through to the Paralympics is a mature one now in many ways. And that's a credit when you say how are things developed for disability sport. In the context of formalized competitive sport, there's a lot more going on. There's lots of the sports now have taken on and are really pursuing their disability.
It's much more out there as well, isn't it? Just even in the mass media, that when we see people like Libby Clegg going on Dancing on Ice, we see athletes who are going on things like Strictly, whilst people will go, well, that's not sport. Well, yes or no, what we're showing is that I always say it's not about the disability, it's about the ability. And if we can demonstrate to the wider masses that disabled people are just as capable, we just need to make some adaptations. Then
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that in that context, also, what we have got now is genuine skills, expertise, experience, and commitment to the development of the Paralympic athlete pathway. So we've long had an Olympic athlete pathway. I think we are now seeing, and that's in part thanks to the underpinning investment of UK sport at an elite level, of Sports England at community level, but also the way the governing bodies have worked. I think we are in a different picture, though, still, for broader opportunity for disabled people to be active. And I think there are a couple of things that I would want to highlight that are a concern for me and things I want to continue to pursue. I mean, this is in the context, as I say, 24 hours on from an active lives, that has said that, as opposed to the last survey a year ago, when 44% of the adult disability population were classed as active, it's now 48%. So that's a significant jump in activity levels, and we should celebrate that. But that's 48 when set against 67 of the population overall. So it's still a significant gap and disparity between the activity levels of disabled people and those of the overall population, as there is to explain the whole strategic intent around tackling inequality for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities versus white, for example, as there is still for women over men. And in disability context, I think for me, there's a concern that we really need to double down on. One is the genuine ability to provide in an accessible way for disability sport and for disabled people to be active. Some of that is physical accessibility, the facilities base, the opportunity. Well, that's the other bit I'm coming on to, the non-sport bit. The sport bit is, are we creating genuinely inclusive and accessible environments for people to be active in? And are we particularly thinking about the social inclusion as well as the accessibility, as well as the physical accessibility? So it's one thing for a tennis club to provide courts that have got suitable runoff to enable wheelchair tennis, for example, or blind tennis. Let's talk about visually impaired tennis. To have the court time made available, it's quite another for the club to actually embrace that and to bring it on and to offer it. So I still think we've got a journey there. But the bigger one for me, you just highlighted and touched on, is that I don't think there's still, in government and across our communities, enough understanding about the additional challenge for disabled people in accessing sport that comes from the greater sort of societal sort of inaccessibility. And that has come to life for me, and we held a quite significant round table for Stephen Timms, the current disabled minister, who I think is more in tune to this than previous, earlier this year, together with the Activity Alliance, the organisation which I think you remember is set up to represent sort of sporting disabled bodies generally, where we highlighted what's called the activity trap. There are a lot of disabled people who are in receipt of benefits that are their personal independence plans, who are genuinely wanting to have an active life, but have a fear, and it's a real fear, that it will negatively impact their benefit position from the assessment, and are prevented therefore from doing so. So I think this is a long answer, but you said what are the situation? I think there's lots to be positive about. The Paralympics is a great calling card for disability sport, but grassroots level, both the accessibility of it in terms of the environment that's created, and that can feel confident. For example, if you've got somebody, a visually impaired person or an amputee or whoever who wants to be active in that sport, but also that non-sporting context of just how much provision is needed, and that social model of disability that we should be, in my view, a society that's much more in tune with.
I couldn't agree more with what you've said. Firstly, what you just said about a tennis club having the runoff for wheelchair, but the club being all embracing. We had a situation, it wasn't tennis, and I won't mention the sport, but it was a while ago where we had done some training with some coaches. And we were all excited, and we run sort of like an advocacy line. People can ring up, I'm interested in sport, tell us what sport you're interested in, we'll direct you to the nearest club that we're confident you can attend for your sport. Sent this gentleman. Now we do follow-up because we want to hear, we want to know, and this gentleman went to the club. I happen to do the follow-up. I like to speak to members, I like to speak to the public, because otherwise I become very removed as the CEO. And it was actually me that did the follow-up on this occasion, and I rang him up 6 weeks afterwards and said, did you go, did you enjoy it? And he said, oh yeah, I got myself to the club. That in itself is a big step for somebody. And I said, what happened? He said, I got to reception and the woman said, we can't deal with your problem. So he didn't even get to meet the coach. Obviously, we dealt with that. We dealt that with the club. We helped the individual. We provided support. But it was a massive lesson for me. It was a lesson that it's not all about the coach. It's skilling up the coach, but changing the culture.
Correct.
So,
and that social accessibility is what I sort of call it, rather than people think that accessibility is all about the built environment.
The wider doors, the ramps.
And yet it's not. It's absolutely not. It's about social accessibility. And it's a societal issue. And going right back, circling back to our opening conversation, this is where we have to see ourselves as a force for good. That actually we can create the change that we want to see through sport. But getting sport first it's a circular argument in some ways, because some people will say, well, you can't change sport when society's like this. And then you go, well, actually, no, we want to try and change society through sport.
And I do believe that things like the Paralympic movement, they change perceptions. They definitely change perceptions. I'm very conscious that, I've got a couple more questions. Just very briefly, how do you see organisations like British Blind Sport fitting into that broader strategy for increasing participation among disabled people?
Well, I'm delighted to say I think the roles that the organisations, the British Blind Sport and the National Disability Sport Organisation network that you're part of are really crucial to it, because what we're talking about here, and what we've talked about in the last half hour or so, is the ability to connect, convene, engage, educate, inform, advocate for, and ultimately create action around issues for blind people in sport. And if you didn't exist, we'd need to invent you for that reason. I think there would be that need to say, well, where's the body that can speak with connection and influence, with credibility, expertise, play a part in the rooms where it happens to make the decisions and the changes that are needed, represent a functional disability in sport as part of, rather than not seeing it as your job to make people good athletes in sport, for example, or good swimmers, or good tennis players, or even good goal ballers, for example, in a visually impaired specific sport, but to be able to create that context and that link. The biggest thing I've always said about the British sporting system, when everyone complains about its complexity, and there's too many bodies and there's too many organisations, and we must simplify, and 5 sports councils, well, for a start, that's devolution. But actually, my own experience after 20 years is that when it can actually come together in a collaborative way and people understand the consequential role they're there to play, it's enormously powerful and additive. And therefore, seeing your role at British Blind Sport to say, you're there to help governing bodies understand better how they can do. You're here to help create conditions for coaches to be better positioned, to create the cultural change that's needed. You're there to engage with as your colleagues do in CP Sport or Wheel Power or with
Our
impairment-specific communities.
Yeah.
And actually sort of say, here's the opportunity to play sport, be active in a way that can make sense for you. I'm a big advocate and passionate advocate for connection rather than sort of an assumption that fewer organisations would do the job better. I think there's a really consequential, important role there. Where we've suffered in the past is where there's been an assumption. I think for a while we thought that governing bodies of sport were the answer regardless of the question, and now we're beginning to realise that actually there's lots of other expertise out there. Sport for development bodies.
Yeah, that expertise is what you've just said. You're bringing in that expertise. I always say to our team, we are a conduit. Let's say it's hockey, ice hockey, goalball, I don't know, tennis, whatever the sport. We will never be experts in that sport. That is down to the national governing bodies, to the clubs. But what we can do is we can teach you over here how to adapt what you do to help that person over there feel part of society and feel like they've got a purpose through sport. We are the conduit. That is literally what I see our role as. Tim, just one big question at the end. You are actually stepping down as CEO of Sport England. That's quite a scary thought for me, because you've been around the whole time I've been around, and you've been such an important and vital player for disability sport. What do you see as your main achievement? And also, really, what's next for you?
I think that's such a kind way of putting it. Thank you. My main achievement, and I think of it as the 20-year journey through UK sport, Sport England, BPA. My main achievement, I think, well, I used to say in the BPAs that I never wore a tracksuit in anger. And what I meant was that I never pretended that I knew about something that I didn't know about in sport.
Okay.
I never went into a dressing room, or I had expert people. I mentioned Penny already. Expert people knew how to do that better. In some ways, my main achievement, I think, has been to understand where I can most make a difference, as opposed to getting involved in everything. And part of that has been about the setting of strategic purpose and the conditions for that strategic purpose to be applied, rather than feeling that it's all about delivery. I can look back. There are individual moments. Actually, it wasn't London. My greatest feeling as at the BPA was the Rio Games, because not only did we absolutely smash it on the field of play, greatest medal haul that we've had in the Summer Games in modern times, but even though it was nothing compared to what was subsequently the case in Tokyo, that Games was enormously challenging to deliver against. I was very proud to be a part of the movement then. So with the performances, we had a really good political stakeholder, sponsor, partner, all the partners that were there. I have a personal highlight, which is that, or a moment in Pyeongchang, actually, when Jen crossed the line for her gold medal in the VI downhill. That was my 100th gold medal in my tenure across 4 games. And I did think maybe that was a moment to go. But across the whole thing with Sport England as well, it is just that recognition that my belief in what's powerful and doable and possible has been where I've put my energy and focus, rather than pretending to be something I'm not.
And so, what's next?
Well, what's next is, as of the 1st of August, I hope a bit of a break. I have actually got a couple of small, very nice things to do. I've got a post with the university in Bath, which I'm going to be doing a bit of work with in and around their sport offer. And they were actually hosts of the Paralympic training camp in 2012. So there's a big connection there with disability sport. But in that, I'm hinting at what's next. I hope to make a continued contribution, but at this stage, quite openly saying that's not necessarily looking for another CEO leadership role for the time being. I've got other things that I want to do and pursue, but I don't want to give up on the passion that I've got for change and make a difference. And I hope to find ways to do that.
Thank you for your time. Can I say you are a very humble man, and we are delighted that you've come into sport and that you hope will stay in sport in some way, but I feel that passion will bring you back. But you do deserve a break. You do deserve to recharge your batteries.
There's definitely some stuff in my hinterland that I'm looking forward to being able to spend a bit more time on. But the privilege of these roles will be something I will definitely miss. Both BPA and Sport England are immensely privileged roles. Sometimes they're pretty hard. It's quite hard work. and the stress for wanting to do the right thing and do the right thing is always there. But it's an enormous privilege, and I know that that will be missed. But I'm also looking forward to and exciting to see the next chapter for Sport England.
Thank you, Tim, for your time.
Thanks very much for having me, Elena.